Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, we're going to be talking about white space in watercolor. It's just as important to think about how much white we want, the lightest values, as it is to think about the color that we want. And it's really good to plan ahead to know how you're going to maintain white or bring back white in your painting and have a plan. So tonight we're going to talk about some options for doing that, and then we'll do an exercise where we can use some of those techniques to show you exactly how to do those. So if you're interested, stay tuned. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to another episode of Healing Art Happy Hour. Tonight we're going to be talking about white space, and just like color is important in watercolor, it's also important to consider the white space, because with watercolor, it is a transparent medium, and you have to really do a little bit of planning, especially if you have a lot of white features that you want to have show up at the end of your piece. So it's important we talked about the value scale. We did a value study. We looked at the various values that you might see in your inspiration piece. Here's an example of a couple. Looking at them in grayscale can help us see, where do we want those bright whites to be, and where do we need to maintain or have white in the final project. So it's a good idea to go ahead and plan your values ahead of time and even map it out on your page with a little bit of pencil or things like that, just so you have an idea and can plan ahead and decide how you want to do it. There are some various ways that you can have the white there, and I'm just going to go over all of those options, or some of the options. There may be more options that I'm not aware of, but these are the ones that I know of that will help you in your planning process. So the first thing that you can do, of course, is to maintain the white. And this is going to be the method that is going to be the purest for those of you who are, more purists and don't want to really delve into mixed media. Saving the white space is the best option for you, because you're not contaminating it with any other medium if you're just kind of working around the white that's already there. Because if you're starting with white paper. Now, if you're working with gouache, you might be working with pigmented papers, and that's a whole nother ballgame. But we're talking about just basic watercolor. So the first is technique. You can think of white as the shape of the object and then paint around it, paint the negative space with your colors. And that's easy to do if the white space is a large area, maybe it's a building or maybe it's a landscape. Like in this case, it's very easy for me to create a horizon or a tree line with my color and leave all of this white in the foreground as my snow. So that's easy enough to do. However, if I look at these trees that I wanted to maintain white, that's a little trickier. So that's not going to be as simple as painting around it. And part of the reason that you can't always paint around little details is because when you start doing painting those details around that, you're going to get brush strokes, or you're going to be moving maybe the paint a little bit too much, or getting some strokes or some blooms that you don't want, because you're not really getting a fluid brush stroke when you're trying to kind of dab around those small shapes. So it would not be easy or advisable for these white trees in the background to go ahead and try to paint around those, especially like, look at how nice and smooth that blue sky is. If I'm trying to paint around that with the blue, I'm going to get a lot of weird paint strokes, because as soon as you touch the paper with your brush, the paint starts to dry. And as I talked about before, when we get those blooms and those, which can be very pretty, where you get different shades of the pigment, it's because it's drying at different speeds. So if you get a pool of paint here and then it's dry over here, or if you go back into a semi-wet with wetter paint, you're going to get some textures in there that you may or may not want, depending on your goal. So it's important to have some other options besides just painting around. Another option of just using technique to leave the white space is dry brushing. And that's where you have a brush that's almost dry. You have some pigment on it, but you dab it off on your cloth so that you're getting a lot of the moisture out. And so when you go to that paper, it's going to basically leave a lot of that paper showing. It's going to create a real, and I'll show you an example of that shortly, but it's going to create a texture along the white tooth of that paper. And that's really nice, especially for water texture and things like that. So dry brushing is another great way to leave some white in more organic way on the page. The next option is using masking tape, and this is great, especially if it's a straight line or something that's geometric, but you can also use masking tape, or they even have, I think it's called frisket film. They have paper that's basically adhesive on one side, and you can use an X-Acto knife and really cut out any shape you want. So you're not limited to those geometric shapes. You can use a bigger, wider tape and like I said, cut it into smaller shapes that you want, or even use the frisket film paper and create even bigger shapes that you want to mask off. So that's another option, and that's where you're going to basically be covering, just like when you're painting your house, you're covering the areas of the page that you don't want paint to touch the paper on. So basically that blocks the paint from making contact with the paper and keeps it white. Masking fluid does the same thing. It's basically like a emulsified latex solution. And so you basically put that on your page, and this allows you to have a little bit more detail because you can brush it on. So you can use a really fine brush and then get some really fine detail in your painting that you want to leave white. So this is a great option, especially for those smaller details. Just make sure that if you're going to be doing that, use a cheaper synthetic brush that you don't care too much about, just because you are putting basically rubber onto the bristles. And if it's a really good brush, you could damage it if you don't clean it well. So one way to avoid damaging it is to put a little bit of dish soap. Just basically prime those bristles with some soap before you use the masking fluid. And I'm going to demonstrate all of these things when we do the demonstration. So that's one way to keep your brush from having that sticky latex rubber stick to the fibers of your brush, and then it's really easy to clean. And then just make sure you clean up real quick afterwards so that it doesn't harden on the brush and ruin it. The other thing is, don't leave this on the page, and this is true for the masking tape as well, just because sometimes those adhesives can start to soften depending on your atmosphere. I live in a very, salty air environment, and I notice that does impact my masking tape. And so sometimes the adhesive starts to come off the tape. Now, this blue tape tends to work really well, a 3M blue tape, but some of those masking tapes are not, they're not all created equal. So you want to make sure it doesn't damage your paper when you lift it off. And the less time it's sitting there, the less time the masking fluid is on your paper, the less likely it's going to really adhere and harden to those fibers of that paper, and less likely it's going to tear the paper or damage it as you release that stickiness. The other thing to be aware of is that oftentimes, and mine is an example of that, oftentimes these masking fluids do have a tint to them. That way, when you put it on your paper, it's not white on white, and you can kind of see where you're putting the masking fluid. And some are better than others at the pigment not being released onto the paper. So be aware that I have seen complaints for some of those. So do read reviews if you're purchasing some masking fluid. These come in a pen form too, so it's a really fine tip. You can just put it on your paper directly from that pen, and you get a really nice fine tip. So just read reviews about it, because I can't really speak on all of those, but I know there are some different options there, and some people are really happy with them. But I have heard some complaints that sometimes the tint will stay on the paper, and it's a light tint, like mine's yellow. I've seen blue, and so just be aware that is an issue that can happen, and read reviews about it to see if the one you're looking at has that. The next option, and this is less pure because at this point now you are adding a mixed media, you are putting something on the paper, and this does not come off the paper. So adding a wax resist, and you can do this through a clear candle, a white crayon, a wax paper, and then you draw over the top of that with a pencil, the wax side down. So you're putting a layer of the wax on the paper. Basically what that does is it blocks any of that pigment from sticking to the paper. It just puts a wax coat on top of that paper. And the problem or the downside of this technique is that you can no longer paint in those areas. So for example, if I wanted to use this technique for these trees, I wouldn't then subsequently be able to draw paint the bark on it. It would basically stay white or at the white level that it is. And that would be that. I wouldn't be able to then change any of that white shape subsequently. So this isn't as good of a choice as these options, but this gives you an interesting texture. And again, I'm going to give you an example. This wax paper with the pencil gives you a really fine option that's hard to get with maybe the masking fluid. You can with those masking pens, but so this is an option to maybe create some really fine like hairs or things like that you know you're going to keep white in the final project. And then just, oh, and I did mention that it won't be paintable once you do that. The next thing that you can do is bring back the white space. So let's say you've accidentally went ahead and laid it down and you forgot to reserve your white. And I've done this a number of times because I just get excited and I start going without too much planning. And that's the type B part of me. I'm a little type A and a little type B. I'm a combo. So sometimes I'm in the mode of let's just get to it. And I forget to save that white space. So there are some options still. It's not the end of the world, depending on what you're trying to get to. One of those is lifting, and we have talked about that. This is an example of I'll get to that. That's the scrubber brush. But you can lift with a simple paper towel or a tissue. So you want to do this while it's wet. So as you lay the paint down and it's still wet, maybe you want to create some clouds or a moon or a sun, and you want to lift up that pigment. And maybe you don't care if there's a little bit of the color there. Some pigment, if it's staining, isn't going to lift as well as the pigment that's non-staining. So it will depend on what pigment you're using, what paint you're using, on how effective this might be. But maybe you do want a little bit of that color down there. So this could be effective if you want to leave a little bit of the orange of the sun, but you want to lift most of it. This is a cool effect you can do, because a lot of times, red can be a little bit staining. Again, depends on which one. You can also, if it's maybe dried more, you can also use a clean, damp brush. Now you can use this wet or dry. The tissue and the paper towel, it really has to still be wet. But if you rinse a brush and it's got a little dampness, you can loosen up the pigment by wetting it, because it's going to stay activatable or it's going to stay soluble. So you just wet it a little bit, and then you start lifting, you start brushing it, the same spot, lift it, clean the brush, go back to the same spot, and you'll be able to lift that pigment as much as possible, depending on the staining of the paint. Now, scrubbing is another option, and that does add a little bit more abrasiveness to the page. So depending on the paper, it could, your paper might be a little too delicate to do this, but they do actually make these scrubber brushes that are designed, they have a really stiff bristle, and they're designed for scrubbing up pigment. So you just wet them, you scrub it in the area, and it'll lift that paint off. Just be really careful. Again, if you don't have durable paper, it could start lifting the fibers of the paper. The next step would be, or next idea would be, to scrape or scratch. This actually does take some of the top layer of the paper off and brings back the white layer underneath. You can also use sandpaper, for that matter, to get some of that effect too, if you're just trying to make a soft area lighter. But this is done typically when it's dry. However, there are some techniques you can do when it's damp as well, with the credit card that I'm going to be showing. But typically you just scrape it, and you'll get some of that that paper will actually come off, and with it, the pigment will go with it, and then you'll get some of the white to show up underneath, and that gives you some nice texture. That's good for some like sunsets on the ocean and some of those waves. You can get effect, or you can even do foliage like some sticks or grass. That's a nice way to bring back white for those. The next method would be using chemistry, and basically salt or alcohol, they create some similar effects, but they basically move the pigment on the page. So when you put the salt down, it absorbs a lot of that water and leaves the pigment around, and it creates some interesting lighter shades. Now, this isn't going to bring you back to white, but it's going to lighten up some areas and give you some nice texture. Same thing with alcohol. It just basically moves that water pigment out of the way and creates some white texture that can be really fun. Now, here are some examples of things that I've talked about. Here's that dry brush technique. You can see some of the paper, or a lot of the paper. In this case, it was a pretty dry brush, but you're getting some of the pigment down and creating a nice texture. This is doing the scraping with the credit card. We're just moving some of that pigment around, creating lighter and darker shades. This is the same thing over here, just done by moving that pigment around. You're not getting complete white, but you're getting some lighter shades. Now, in this case, I did do the lifting while it was wet, but these were staining pigments, and so I didn't get complete white, but I did get I got some white back, not complete white. And that's the difference, that you might see if you have a non-staining versus staining. These are both kind of staining, but I don't mind the look of those. You can still tell there's the moon there. Now, if you scrape into wet, and we did this the other day, if you scrape into a wet painting with the cut credit card, you're going to get darker lines if it's too wet. If you wait until it's almost dry, you can actually start either scraping. This is actually scraping some of the paper off, but you can actually get some of that pigment to move and create white lines. And I have an example of that I'll show you in a little bit. But that's an attempt to get some light lines, but because it was too wet, that pigment fills into to where the paper is pressed down and embossed, and that fills in with pigment. Now, here's an example of the salt effect. See how it creates this really atmospheric, almost like a snowstorm, snowflakes effects. And that's great for doing underwater type things, or tree barks, or boulders, things like that you want a nice texture on, and it gives a nice light to dark contrast. And then I'd already talked about the lifting with the tissue. And like I said, it didn't lift as well as some other colors might in that case. The next option is to add, and this is the most, I guess, this would not be the purist's method, because all of these things really turn it into mixed media. Even for some people, watercolor paint. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about when to use white watercolor paints and when not to, the do's and don'ts of that. But some people don't consider it like watercolor paint. They consider it gouache, which is a watercolor. It's water-based, but gouache behaves different than standard watercolor. And because it's opaque more than the standard watercolor. Normally you get this nice translucence, and you have this light that kind of shines through. And when you look at all of these spots, it's hard to see in a picture, but if you were to look at this painting and even look at it from an angle, you would notice it would be more matte, or maybe if I'm using the gel pen, it might be a little bit shiny. If I'm using acrylic paint, it might have some shine to it. So it's just going to look a little bit different than the underpainting is going to be look. So for those of you, or those people that, are really like purist about watercolor, they wouldn't think that this is okay. They would rather you mask off these splotches by just splattering some masking fluid. But this is an option, and I often use a white gel pen because I have control, and it's hard for me to plan all these white spaces ahead of time. So I often do add some splatter, either watercolor paint or acrylic paints on top, or even acrylic ink you can use over the top of it. So there are options if you're okay with, you know, making a mixed media and nobody's going to care. To me, I think that, you know, it adds some different dimension and it's fun because you can use different things and they all look a little bit different. And I think it just adds dimension to it. But I'm a mixed media person, so I don't care. This is an exercise you can do where you just basically are going to try all these techniques, and we're going to go through, I'm not going to do it exactly like this, but I'm going to go through all of these. This is the sample of all of the techniques that I'm going to be showing tonight, but I'm going to put them on an abstract and I'm going to use these techniques while creating it. And I'm just going to use one color because right now we're still focusing on the technique, not the color mixing. Next week, I'm hoping to do a piece that includes all of the theories that we've talked about, the color mixing, these techniques, keeping the white space, all of that. I'm planning to put it all together and create something that's a little bit more colorful. And I know it gets kind of boring with just using one color, but I'll tell you, when you're learning these techniques, it just helps you not to get caught up in the color of it. So just pick a color. I like, you know, darker color just because you can see the contrast a little bit better. Like I for sure wouldn't pick yellow, but you can really pick any other color that you want. So if there's a tube of paint you just want to kind of use up and practice, then that's perfect thing for it. Now to create these little divisions, I have some masking tape that's this fine, but you can even use the washi, like if you have some old washi tape or something like that, or you can just draw lines. I like the paint there, or the tape there, because it helps contain the paint from one square to the other, and that's handy. So you can even just, you know, trim up some of your masking tape, you know, cut it in half or, you know, whatever. But I would recommend just trying out these things so you can see what the technique looks like with your materials. All right, do's and don'ts of watercolor paint. As I mentioned, there's controversy about this subject. And so here's my 2 cents. When you're using it, think of it as gouache, not really regular watercolor. And there are different whites. There is Chinese white, which is usually, I think it's PW4 is the pigment code, pigment white 4, which tends to be more neutral. It's semi-opaque, so it's not as chalky as maybe titanium white, which is a cool, very bright white. Those are 2 common whites that you might see in kits. And it's interesting because even in beginner kits, they add a white. And I think it's very confusing because it's not like in acrylics where when you want a tint of a color, when you want to get a pink, you add white. This is not the case with watercolors. In watercolors, because it's transparent, if you want pink, then you just leave more of the white to show under, and that makes it more pink. If you add white to it, it's going to make it chalkier than what you're looking for. So instead of getting a nice rose water pink, you're going to get a nice Pepto-Bismol pink. And if that's what you're going for, if you're doing a piece where, let's say you're doing, you're painting a little village, a little Greek village on the hills, and there's a lot of these pastel colors that are more opaque, and you really want those peaches and those that creamy mint and those colors, you can get that by mixing the white with your paint, and you get those pastels. So use it like a gouache, because they tend to be opaque because they basically have some kind of chalk in them. Zinc oxide, I believe, is what is used for the Chinese white, and I think it's titanium dioxide is the titanium. But anyway, it's basically this ground white dust, so that's going to make it opaque. If you're going to use it on your painting for highlights, make sure it's the final layer, because regardless of whether it's gouache or a regular watercolor, it says gouache or not, both of those are a watercolor and soluble pigment, meaning that if you go on top of it or you wet it, it's going to loosen. And so you want to be really careful that if your painting is dry underneath. If it's not dry, that's going to mix in, it's going to spread, and you're going to get that opacity mixed in with your color that's under it. But likewise, if you go on top of it, it's going to basically somewhat mix with whatever you put on it, because the wetness of that, what you're putting on top of it's going to loosen that pigment. And so you're going to get a chalky color. You're not going to get a nice translucent color over the top of it. And you do want to be really careful not to overwork it as a result of that. Anytime you're laying down those layers, you have to be careful not to work too much to lift the layer below it. So true also for the white. You can, like I mentioned earlier, mix it with color if you want to create some gouache pastels, or if you're trying to make it matte or opaque and milky. And sometimes you might want to, like if you look, for example, at some of the fruits like figs or plums, you know how they have sort of this milky hue over the top of them. Using a little bit of white over the top of it can give you that milky effect that you might be looking for. So there are applications for it that might work perfectly. I like to sometimes use it in clouds because I can get a mix of some depth and sort of milkiness within the clouds to make, because sometimes the clouds kind of have a solid look to them. So depending on what I'm trying to make it look like, I might use my white to do that. And it can create some interesting effects when you do that. So play around with it, try it out. Don't be afraid of it, but also just remember it's not the same thing as the rest of the paints, and it is confusing to see them in, especially in beginner palettes. It's the same with black too. I would say use black sparingly. Try out whatever you have in mind before you put it on your painting, because the first thing I would try to do is use the complementary colors in the palette that you're already using. So for example, if you're using green and red, try mixing up a black with those two colors first before you tie in that other black, because blacks are a mix of colors, and they have different, when you lighten them, they turn different shades. Like some of them are more blue, some of them are more green, some of them are more brown, and you don't know what you're going to get until you mix it. So just test, whether it's white or black, test any mixes with those on a separate piece of paper before you add them to your work, just to be sure that it's not going to ruin it, because either of those two can destroy the brightness of your painting. Now, don't expect a lot of transparency. Like I said, they are going to have some, whether you have the semi-opaque or the opaque, they're going to have some opacity. So you're not going to get, it's not going to be as sheer across if you paint over something else. So like I said, do a little test samples with that. Don't mix it with colors just to tint the color, because you're going to make it milky, and that's not going to be, you're not going to get what you expect probably. Don't work the brush too much when applying it, meaning if you're putting it over a color, if you mix it too much, you're going to start picking up the pigment underneath, and then you're going to make it a milky color of what that is, instead of it being white. So if you're trying to get a white, just be real careful when laying it down, keep it pretty dry, and so that you can control it exactly where you want it. And then again, same thing, don't paint over the top of it, because again, it's going to absorb up into that wet paint, and it's going to make that milky as well. And I would say, be really careful when you're mixing a color with white, not to do it in your color wells where your paints are, because you don't want to contaminate your pure pigments with white, because it's just harder to get rid of, and it can damage. Like sometimes I might, if I'm making orange, I might dip a little bit, I dip in the yellow and then I dip in the red, and I might get a little yellow in my red, but that's not going to change the, that's going to change a little bit the color maybe next time I use that red, but it's not going to change the look of it. And if I get white in there, that could ruin my paint, and it could be hard to get it out. I mean, you can clean your palette, but it's just a little bit trickier, and you don't want any amount of milky if that's not your intention. So just be really careful when you're mixing it. I would say mix it elsewhere, not near your other pigments. And be aware that this is one of the challenges with some of the cheaper products that are out there. Oftentimes, as an extender or a filler, they will use these white pigments, and they don't have to disclose that. And that's why oftentimes when you buy these, even you can look at them in the palettes, they look kind of like chalk until you wet them. That's because they are literally using chalk in the product. And so you're going to get a milkier, a chalkier look to it. And it's going to just get worse as you try mixing colors. So just be aware if you are using, one of those, cheaper palettes, you might experience that. And that's not you. It's not your mixing. That's just that there may be some chalk that's in that product. And it can cause it to be milky and create muddy colors. All right, that's all I have for my notes tonight. And now I'm going to go ahead and get to the demonstration screen so we can start practicing some of these techniques. And then you guys can ask any questions if you have any. So let me just go ahead and stop. So you should be seeing my workspace. I have my old dried up palette of indigo, and I still have a little blob there, my clean and dirty water. In this case, it's kind of nice because I'm using the same color. So even if it's dirty, it's just going to be dirty with the color that I'm using. So that simplifies it a little bit. I am using arches. I already taped it down to my surface. The first thing I'm going to do is masking because the idea that I have in mind makes sense for me to do it that way because I'm going to kind of divide up some sections. So I'm going to start with creating some fun masking dividers. Now you can, of course, use these however you want. You could follow along with how I'm doing it, or you can use your own designs. Feel free to go rogue. And I'm just taking my some masking tape and an X-Acto knife. And I'm just going to create some interesting strips. I'm sort of wiggling as I go down. So I'm going to do like a layer, some layers. If I was doing birch trees, for example, I would do a similar thing, except for I'd make sure that it goes from, thin to thick, because usually the base of the trunk is always thicker and it tapers as it goes out. Now, I can just lift it right off my cutting board. This one's got the straight side, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to start with the inside pieces, because they're kind of wonky on both sides. I don't want one straight edge. So I'm just going to run this across my page at different angles, creating these little segments. Okay, then for my next trick, I'm going to just use the method of painting the negative space. So I'm going to think about, I'm going to do in this upper section here, I'm just going to paint around the shapes that I want to maintain white. So I'm going to think about what shape do I want. You can think geometric shapes, you can do lines, you can do dots, squares, whatever, triangles, whatever you want to do. Just pick whatever you're inspired to pick. I'm going to go ahead and re-wet my palette. One of the things I love about watercolor is, you can not waste it. Like with acrylics, once you put it down on your palette, and it dries, it's over. Game over. I would like to offer you a cautionary tale. I realized when I did this, the first project that I did with this paint, and it's a different palette, but I do mixed media, right? So I use these palette or these little dishes for a lot of different mixed media stuff because they're easy to clean. And I used it for some glue. And I didn't realize that I had let the kind of like an Elmer's glue, like a school glue, I had let it dry on here and I didn't see it. And so I added this paint and I kept saying, what is that film? And I kept feeling something sticky when I was doing class the other day. And then later I realized, oh no, there's glue on here. So I'm not sure how that impacted the way my watercolor worked, but it seemed to do okay, but it might have diluted it out a little bit. So make sure you clean your dishes, your mixing dishes real well. Okay, so I got a nice dark mix. And you do want to make sure whenever you're painting, mix up plenty of the color you're working on. If you're going to try to do fluid strokes, try to get enough mix so that you can complete whatever step you're on. Because if you have to mix it up again, you're going to get those drying issues where, you know, it's already half dry by the time you go back into it and it's not going to look the same. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do here is just create some vertical shapes. Now keep in mind, I'm thinking about the white space, not the color. Okay, so that's the example of painting that negative space. Now dry brushing, I'm going to try to get as much of that pigment out, or not as much of the paint and the water and pigment out. So I'm just going to run it across the edge to run it so it's not real wet. And then I'm going to see if that's dry enough. I'm going to use the body of my brush, so I'm holding it kind of like a 45-degree angle and traveling more sideways with my round brush to use the body. That's not enough, so I have to add a little bit more. Okay, we've already used some masking tape, and so now I'm going to show masking fluid. Now, one of the things that I've recently discovered, because one of the frustrations I have about masking fluid is it does tend to thicken over time. One of the things I want to say is don't shake this, because shaking it makes the particles that are sticky stick together more. So it actually makes it worse, even though you're tempted to, because the pigment that's in mine is all here at the bottom. So it looks like I need to shake it. And it doesn't really, let's see. I feel like I read through to see if I'm supposed to shake it or not. And I couldn't find that it said that. So I have made the mistake of shaking it when I'm not supposed to, but I did some research on it and they're like, don't shake it. And that makes sense. And if you look at it, it's so thick, I can't really even pour it. Like if I try to pour it into my dish, I can't. It's pretty solid in there. However, it's creamy and I can lift some out. And if I just add a little bit of water, you can activate it. So I'm just going to take some I'm just taking it with the back of my brush just to move it over into this well in clumps. Ideally, you use it while it's still nice and wet. When you first get it, it's real liquid. But the problem is, unless you use it all the time, this is probably going to happen to you. So I'm just sharing this so that you guys know what to do if it happens, because it's not inexpensive. So it's nice to be able to use it and not just throw it away. I think I threw some away last time because I'm like, okay, it's all ruined. And then I had to buy some more. And then it felt like it wasn't that long and it was ruined. So, so here's, you can just add a little bit of water. And I don't use my bristles to mix it. I just use something else until I'm ready. I don't want my bristles in there more than they have to be. So I'm just using the back of my brush, but you can use a chopstick or anything, but you can get it, it'll loosen up. And then, and it doesn't have to be real thick of a coating. And especially if you want to do details, you want it fairly thin because you want to be able to get details on your page. So it helps to have it thinner. I'm using a synthetic. They're pretty firm bristles, so I have control. And here's my dish soap. I'm going to start with just wetting my bristles first. Kind of massaging the water into it. So I'm sort of priming, and then I'm dipping it in here and working it so that the soap is worked into the bristles too. I don't want a big clump of soap on there because then I'm dipping it into here, and then that protects my bristles. And now I can go in here and make whatever designs that I want. I'm just putting some circles in. It's going to be hard to see. I don't really see a lot of that yellow, even though it has that tint, but that could just be because my lighting isn't all that great. But if you look at it at an angle, you can see it on your paper. So that's what I do. I just look for, because it stays shiny even when it's not wet, it stays a little bit shiny. So you can see it. And this is nice, especially if you're doing like tree branches or things like that, where you really want those fine details. It's going to be a lot easier to do. You could do the big trunks with the tape, but then doing the little branches with the masking fluid. And then as soon as I'm done, I'm rinsing off my brush real good. And I'm physically pulling any rubber or any latex that's on that brush. In this case, you could, dip it in a little bit more dish soap just to help give it extra cleaning. Just don't want that to harden on your bristles. So, okay. So the next one is doing a wax resist. And I think I'll do a mix of them here. Let me show you my examples that I did on my exercise sheet. So here's my example of my painting around the shape. Here's my dry brush, masking with tape, masking using masking fluid. This is an example of those, if you want to do those craggly branches. And then here's what candle looks like. And you can see there's still some of the texture there. And crayon, the white crayon, had a clear. It covered more of the paper. So you get a little bit more of the paper coming through with the candle than you do with the white crayon. I also tried white wax pencil, and I have high quality wax pencils that don't have as much wax in them. So they didn't work real well. But if you had maybe a Crayola wax, you know, the higher wax content, the better that might actually work. So you could try it with whatever you have. If you have something like a Crayola or dollar store wax pencils, you might get more wax content. But if you have like a Prismacolor or something that's a little bit higher end, you may not get, it may not work as well. It's subtle. It still gives you something. So it's a subtle effect, but it's just not going to be as clear. Now, this was the biggest surprise of how cool the drawing on wax paper turned out to be. So I think that's a really cool effect. And these are the three that I'm going to show next, is this candle, crayon, and the wax paper. And I just use for my candle, I have just a birthday candle that came off from a birthday cake. And it even has chocolate on it. So. And these are hard to see when you're doing it. You just have to kind of know where you are in space. So that's the biggest challenge for using these things, because it's not like you can really see it on your paper very well. You could try to look at it from an angle and it is a little shiny. So that's one little tip. All right, so the triangles are the wax candle. And then I'm going to put some little dots. With the crayon, the white crayon. Make sure that before you paint on any of the masking fluid that it's completely dry. And now we're going to bring back some white space. So I'm going to go ahead and paint. I'm still going to let this dry a little bit more. So I'm going to leave that one. That's kind of why I separated them, so I could work in each section separately. Voila, mágico. That's that wax resist. And you can see there's some pigment in those areas. It's not completely white. I'm going to, because it takes a little bit longer, I'm going to go ahead while this is wet, and I'm going to add a little bit of salt. On this side, I'm going to add salt. And then on that side, I'm going to put a little bit of alcohol. See how it pushes that pigment around. And some paint, it's going to be more. It's going to be more, you'll see more of a difference than others. Again, it depends on the pigments. And this one you want to do pretty quickly. Hopefully didn't wait too long. But you're just basically going to press it down. And there's a hole in the middle of my cork, so that's why there's a kind of a hole in the middle of the circle. So the other thing I could do is, if I crinkle this up and I lift, I can create some clouds. Some cloud effects. So isn't that a cool inky night sky right there? Hello, everyone. I just wanted to give a little reminder to please like or subscribe and share. That really helps us with YouTube acknowledging our existence. So please do that. Just a reminder. Thank you. Let's continue. Now, the other thing and this is, of course, when it gets to the perfect timing, is scratching out that pigment. And it can be, well, sometimes it takes some of the paper like that did, but sometimes it just moves the pigment. It's really lifting up the paper. And then if I want to just move the pigment around, taking the side of that credit card, you can make little mountain peaks or little boulders, things like that. You can have some fun. So now I've got my night sky and my mountain peaks. And I can even, while it's still somewhat wet, you can do this wet or dry. You can lift that pigment with a clean brush. It's always damp, never completely dry. Instead, just because these are a little bit firmer. But let's say I just want to lift up some of that pigment. You just keep going over the same area. Now this is a staining pigment, so it's not going to lift it back to that white, but you can see I'm getting some lifting there. And if I use the scrubber brush, just adds, I have a very small scrubber brush, but it just adds a little extra. And this is usually when you want to use it when it's dry. So I'm going to go up to the top here. And let's just say I want to start with just kind of wetting, oops, too much. Wetting the area you want to lift. And then you kind of scrub it. Scrub. And like I said, it may take some of the fibers of your paper. So just be real careful if you're trying out this particular one. And the other one also needs to be dry. So I'm going to let that dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and paint my this was the masking fluid. So you can see, I'm going to put this just aside for a minute. So this is the wax, using the wax paper and then just writing with pencil on top of it. But make sure you figure out which side is waxed down. I'll just do both sides and then one of them will be correct. So I'm going to say hi. And then I'm going to flip it over. I think this side worked much better. So I think that was the correct. Yeah, this one I was able to fill in. So this must have been the wax side. But see how you can get this nice detail with that wax paper and pencil? It does kind of emboss the paper a little bit. It presses down the paper, but it fills it with wax so that it still acts as a resist against the paint. Still basically seals the paper so that you're not getting that pigment to attach to those fibers. So it shows the white through there. And that would be great for like animal hair or those kinds of details that you might want to get. The problem with this route is if you put wax on your paper, you can't lift it. You can't paint over it. So if you don't like how it turned out, that's just that. It's going to be what it is. So the nice thing about the masking fluid is you're maintaining fresh paper. You're not damaging the fibers in any way, in any permanent way. So if I wanted to fill in one of these circles, or let's say I have this extra circle I don't like, I could go in and paint that out if I want later on, but I can't do that if I'm using the wax. And this is examples of the wax. All right, now I'm going to show you, I want to show you the scratching. See if I can do it over here. It might not be completely dry, but so you can do it two ways. You can use you either use the sharper tip. You kind of want to go sideways. You don't want to slice into it, or else you're going to cut into your paper. So you do want to hold it a little bit sideways, but I'm just going to hold it sideways at the tip, and I can create, if I go hard enough, I can basically lift some of that paper and get the white underneath. So I can create, it's good for like foliage or creating bark. And then I can also go sideways. And if I do enough on going sideways, I can also, and I'm just putting more of the weight down, but I could eventually lift some of that paper up too and get some texture. This paper is not completely dry. It's gonna work a little better when it's more dry, but you can basically get some texture and lift some of that pigmented paper off so that you get the white underneath. Depends on the paper too. This would be really hard on delicate paper. And if you're using, if you're not using a 100% cotton or a higher durability paper, that might not work out. Play around with all of these different techniques to see how it works with your unique materials. I think that's the key here. All right, I'm going to go ahead, and I think I can, well, this is a little bit wet. I'm going to go ahead and lift these guys because this is done. So that's my using the masking tape. Just be gentle, because sometimes, depending on the masking tape, it could lift your paper. So go slow, and if it's sticking, you can heat it a little bit with a hair dryer to try to soften the adhesives. And then the masking fluid, don't ever, well, be careful if you're heating other area, like drying. I wouldn't try not to put too much heat on the masking fluid. Like don't use the hair dryer to dry this area if you have masking fluid down. I wouldn't recommend doing that, just because that's going to affect that adhesive. And I'm going to go ahead and just get the salt off screen. And because it's abstract, I can kind of have it go any direction I want. Maybe I want the moon up in the sky. And or once the paint's dry, you can get rid of the masking fluid. You can use your finger, but just make sure it's clean. Or you can even use a gentle eraser. Don't scrub too hard. They actually have an eraser that's designed specifically to remove this. Now, hopefully the paint is dry enough. If I wanted to go in here and, put, for example, if I wanted to make some bark on the tree or something like that, like a shadow on one side, I could do that because now I can paint on it. Whereas I can't do that if I do the wax. Like I can still make, I could still make the branches darker if I want. I could have shadows and things like that. And I can't do that if I do it with the wax over here. I can't cover that white space. It's just going to always stay white. So that's the benefit of masking, whether it's with masking tape or masking fluid or even these other methods. I can go in now and I can still add some pigment. Let's say I wanted to make this the shadow side. I don't want it as dark as the rest, but I still want some color. I can go in and do that because I haven't damaged the paper, whereas the wax will do that. So just as long as you know if it's going to be permanent or temporary, that's the important thing, is that you understand. So adding white back, this was all either maintaining the white or in some way, or bringing the white back, but we can also add white. And you can use, this is an acrylic ink. You can use acrylic paint. And again, you're gonna create a different look on your painting. So just be aware of that. But if you're okay with that, you can do some fun things. One of my favorite things to do is to do splashing. And you can do that with any of these. So let's start with this area down here. I want to make sure I'm not getting it on the other areas. But I can basically, I'm going to start with watercolor paint. And mine is titanium white. It's a very cool, bright white. But just really want to get a lot of that pigment on your brush, and then you can tap it either on your finger or, and then it splatters so it can look like stars. Now, if you do it when it's wet, that pigment will diffuse out a little bit and make bigger, more diffuse stars. But if you do it when it's dry, they're gonna dry smaller, more distinct stars. So that's a fun effect that you can do. And you can do that with the white paint, the white watercolor. And you can also do that with your acrylics and your white ink. But because I don't want to splatter the other one, I'm just going to do some other techniques with these different pigments. With the acrylic inks, I'm going to use my other brush that's synthetic. So I can, instead of splattering, I could just dab in some stars if I wanted to. Or if I was trying to create some highlights or something, let's say I was trying to make these clouds have a little bit of some texture and some shape, I could go in and create some like top areas that are highlights. And as long as I don't have it too concentrated, it kind of softens up in there as it dries. It's not staying real stark. This is the acrylic ink. So it just kind of blended right in there and created a little bit of some highlight, but not too, it's not like really sitting on top as much. And that you can get that kind of soft, subtle effect with the watercolor as well. Or maybe I want to put snow on something, like a snow-capped mountain. Now, let's see, I'm just going to put a little bit of acrylic color. And you can water down acrylic paint. So if it's too thick and you really want to, you can just add a little bit of water. You can actually use acrylics kind of like watercolor. They're not going to behave the same way, but you can get some of the similar effects. You can water it down and make a more translucent look to them. So if you don't have watercolors, but you want to try out some of the techniques, you can try it with acrylics and get some similar results. May not be, it's not going to be as good as watercolor, but you can get some interesting results with it. So I'm going to create some snow peaked mountains, maybe. And because I'm losing the page. Because I'm adding a little bit of water to whatever these are that I'm adding, it's picking up a little bit of the pigment below. So it's softening the white of the color. Because it's basically, see how that sort of disappeared there, the ink that I put down. So you will find that can happen when you lay down the white. It may not stay as stark. So try different things, see what works best. Maybe that was just too thin and too watery, and it just absorbed that color up into it, and it didn't keep the white. Like maybe I want to bring back more of the white of this moon. Maybe I want this one side to be brighter. So play around with different things and see how it works for you, given what you have. I'm always about experimenting. That's how I learn new things, is just exploring. Now, I also wanted to show you an example of what happens when you mix white paint with colors. Like how that compares to just leaving the white space. And I'm going to show you with red. Now, I'm not going to mix it with the acrylic, although you could play around with that too, mixing watercolor pigments with acrylic, but just experiment with whatever. If you're going mixed media, anything goes. Give it a try. Now I'm going to just take a different brush, since this one's nice and saturated with whites, and I'm going to just go into pink. If I wanted to make red on my page, I could make a more concentrated red, and then as I move it along and add water, I can make a lighter shade and a lighter shade and a lighter shade. And that's how you would go from concentrated to light in the pinks, is by doing that. I didn't have enough concentration at the start, but so you can get your whole range of color there. But now if I go in here and I mix this with white, see, I'm getting a really creamy salmon color. It's going to be really hard for me to get a deep color, and it's going to be really creamy and chalky looking. It really just depends on what you're going for. You can make a really cool, smooth background. That might be like a really cool effect that you want to incorporate. As long as you know what you're going to get. You're going to get opacity. So if that's what you're looking for, it's going to be more like using gouache. So you could really turn all of your paints into pastels, into like a pastel gouache, just by mixing the pigment with the white. Thank you, everybody, for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you find this content helpful. And as always, happy creating. Bye.